In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Frederick, Colorado, a perfect family facade concealed one of the most chilling crimes in recent American history. What happens when the man who promises to love and protect becomes the predator? What drives a father to commit the unthinkable against his own flesh and blood? This is the story of Christopher Watts, a man whose double life and devastating choices would shatter not just his own family, but the very notion of safety within our own homes. Before we dive into this haunting case, I want you to ask yourself, how well do we really know the people closest to us? By the end of this video, that question might take on an entirely different meaning. To understand the magnitude of what happened on that August morning in 2018, we need to first understand the players in this tragic story. Christopher Lee Watts and Shanann Catherine Ruzicek seemed like any other American couple chasing their version of the dream. Both originally from North Carolina, Chris from Spring Lake and Shanann from Aberdeen, their paths crossed in 2010. What began as a romance would culminate in marriage on November 3, 2012, in Mecklenburg County. But this wasn't just a story of two people falling in love, it was the beginning of what appeared to be a thriving family unit. Their daughters arrived like little rays of sunshine. First came Bella Marie, born December 17, 2013, a bright-eyed little girl who her family lovingly called Bells. Nearly 2 years later, on July 17, 2015, Celeste Catherine joined the family, affectionately known as Cece. These weren't just names and dates, these were real children with personalities, dreams, and futures that stretched endlessly ahead of them. By 2013, the family had moved to Colorado, purchasing a substantial 5-bedroom home at 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick. This wasn't a modest starter home, it was a statement of success, complete with modern amenities and enough space for a growing family. But beneath this picture of prosperity, cracks were already beginning to form. Chris worked for Anadarko Petroleum, a stable job in Colorado's thriving energy sector. Shanann, meanwhile, had embraced the world of multi-level marketing, working from home selling a wellness product called Thrive for a company named Lavelle. She wasn't just a casual participant, Shanann threw herself into this work with infectious enthusiasm, regularly posting on social media about the products and the lifestyle they afforded her family. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. In 2015, just 2 years after purchasing their dream home, the Watts family declared bankruptcy. The financial stress was real and it was mounting. Yet from the outside, especially on social media, everything still appeared perfect. Shanann continued to project success and happiness, sharing moments of family bliss that painted a picture of domestic harmony. By August 2018, there was even more reason for celebration. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they had already decided to name Nico. The family was expanding again, and publicly, Chris seemed supportive and excited about becoming a father of 3. But what the world didn't see was the storm brewing behind closed doors. What they couldn't have imagined was that this pregnancy announcement would be among the last happy moments this family would ever share. The weekend of August 11th and 12th, 2018, was the final weekend the Watts family ever spent together. Shanann had been away on a business trip to Arizona, not unusual for her Lavelle work, which often involved travel for conferences and team-building events. These trips were part of the lifestyle she had embraced, opportunities to network, learn, and grow her business. During this time, Chris was home alone with Bella and Cece. To neighbors and anyone who might have observed, this would have seemed like a normal father-daughter weekend. Maybe there would be cartoons, breakfast for dinner, and the kind of relaxed rules that often come when mom is away. But what was actually happening in that house during those crucial hours remains largely a mystery. What we do know is that by Sunday evening, Shanann was returning home. Her friend and colleague, Nicole Atoft Atkinson, had picked her up and was driving her back to Frederick. This wasn't unusual. Nicole and Shanann had developed both a professional relationship through Lavelle and a genuine friendship. The drive home from the airport was probably filled with conversation about the weekend, the trip, and plans for the week ahead. At approximately 1:48 a.m. on Monday, August 13, 2018, Nicole dropped Shanann off at her home on Saratoga Trail. In any other circumstance, this would have been an unremarkable moment, a friend helping another friend get home safely after a business trip. Shanann probably gathered her bags, said goodbye to Nicole, and walked into her house, likely expecting to find her husband and daughters asleep. But what happened next transformed this ordinary moment into the last time Shanann Watts was ever seen alive. What occurred in those early morning hours was so horrific that it soon captured national attention and left investigators struggling to comprehend the depth of evil that had unfolded in this suburban home. Monday, August 13th, dawned like any other day in Frederick, Colorado, but it quickly became clear that something was terribly wrong at the Watts household. The first red flag came when Shanann missed a scheduled obstetrics and gynecology appointment. For a pregnant woman who was meticulous about her health care and excited about her pregnancy, this was completely out of character. Nicole Atkinson, the friend who had dropped Shanann off just hours before, grew increasingly concerned as the morning progressed. She had been texting Shanann throughout the morning, but her messages were going unanswered. This wasn't like Shanann at all. She was typically very responsive to communication, especially when it came to business matters. The concern escalated when Shanann missed a scheduled business meeting. Anyone who knew her would tell you that Shanann took her level work seriously. She prided herself on being professional and reliable. Missing a business meeting without explanation wasn't just unusual, it was virtually impossible for someone with her dedication to her work. By 12:10 p.m., Nicole's worry had transformed into genuine alarm. She decided to drive to the Watts home to check on her friend personally. When she arrived at 2825 Saratoga Trail, the house appeared quiet and undisturbed from the outside. She rang the doorbell and knocked on the door, but there was no response. The silence was deafening. This is where Nicole made a decision that would prove crucial to the entire investigation. Rather than simply assuming the family was out, she trusted her instincts that something was wrong. She called Chris Watts at his workplace to ask about Shanann and the girls. According to later reports, Chris told her he didn't know where they were and suggested maybe they had gone to a friend's house. But Nicole wasn't satisfied with this explanation. Her concern for her friend overrode any hesitation about seeming overly worried. At approximately 12:10 p.m., she made the call that would officially begin one of the most intensive missing persons investigations Colorado had seen in years. She contacted the Frederick Police Department to request a welfare check. The responding officer arrived at the Watts home around 1:40 p.m. This is where the investigation began in earnest, and it's important to understand how unusual the scene was that greeted law enforcement. When Chris Watts arrived home from work to meet the police officer, he readily gave permission for a search of the house. To an outside observer, this might have seemed like the cooperative behavior of a concerned husband and father. But what they found inside the house told a different story entirely. The family dog was there, unharmed but seemingly confused by the absence of his family. Shanann's purse was discovered inside the home, still containing her keys and medication, items that any woman would take with her if she were leaving voluntarily with her children. Perhaps most tellingly, Shanann's phone was found wedged between the cushions of the family couch. In today's world where our phones are practically extensions of ourselves, finding someone's phone left behind is often the first sign that something is seriously wrong. For a businesswoman like Shanann, who relied on her phone for work communication and staying connected with clients, leaving without her phone was unthinkable. The family car was still in the garage, and investigators noted that the girls' car seats were still inside. Any parent will tell you that you don't take young children anywhere without their car seats. It's not just impractical, it's illegal. The presence of these seats suggested that if Bella and Cece had left the house, they hadn't gone willingly or safely. But perhaps the most haunting discovery was Shanann's wedding ring, found on the bedside table in the master bedroom. A wedding ring represents the bond between spouses, the promise of love and fidelity. Finding it casually discarded on a bedside table raised immediate questions about what had transpired between husband and wife in their final moments together. By Tuesday, August 14th, it was clear that this was no ordinary missing persons case. The FBI and Colorado Bureau of Investigation joined local law enforcement, bringing with them resources and expertise that suggested authorities were taking this disappearance very seriously indeed. Chris Watts, meanwhile, was playing the role of the concerned husband and father. In interviews with local television stations KMJ TV and Kusa TV, he stood outside his home pleading for the safe return of his wife and daughters. To viewers watching these appeals, Chris appeared to be a man in anguish, desperate for answers about his missing family. But investigators were already noticing inconsistencies in his story. Chris claimed he had last seen Shanann at 5:15 a.m. on Monday morning when he left for work. According to his account, she was asleep in bed, and he had no idea where she might have gone with the girls. He suggested that perhaps she had taken them to a friend's house and would return soon. However, this timeline didn't align with what investigators were discovering. They knew that Shanann had only arrived home at 1:48 a.m., less than 3.5 hours before Chris claimed to have last seen her. For a pregnant woman returning from a business trip in the early hours of the morning, it would have been natural to sleep in, not to get up and leave the house with 2 young children before dawn. The investigation was aided by something that has become increasingly common in modern criminal cases: surveillance footage. A neighbor's security camera had captured activity around the Watts home during the crucial early morning hours of August 13th. While the footage wouldn't be released publicly until months later, investigators were already analyzing what it revealed about the movements around the Watts property. Search dogs were brought to the scene, and their behavior was telling. During one of Chris's television interviews, viewers could actually hear the search dogs working on the property in the background. These highly trained animals were picking up scents and following trails that would prove crucial to understanding what had really happened. The community response was overwhelming. Frederick is the kind of place where neighbors look out for each other, and the disappearance of a pregnant mother and 2 small children mobilized an army of volunteers. Search parties combed through local parks, open spaces, and anywhere the family might have gone. Social media exploded with sharing posts about the missing family, their photos circulating far beyond Colorado's borders. But as the hours turned into days, hope began to fade. The circumstances were simply too suspicious for this to be a voluntary disappearance. Shanann's social media presence, which had been so active and positive, had gone completely silent. For someone who shared regular updates about her life and work, this silence was deafening. The pressure on Chris Watts was intensifying with each passing hour. Investigators were asking harder questions, and his answers weren't satisfying their growing suspicions. The timeline he provided didn't make sense, his demeanor during interviews was raising red flags, and the physical evidence at the house suggested something far more sinister than a spontaneous trip. Wednesday, August 15th, would prove to be the day when this investigation took a dramatic turn. Law enforcement had decided it was time to apply more pressure to the person they were increasingly viewing not as a victim's family member, but as their primary suspect. August 15, 2018, began as another day of searching and hoping, but it would end with one of the most shocking confessions in recent criminal history. The FBI had joined the investigation in full force, and they brought with them tools and techniques that would prove instrumental in breaking this case wide open. Chris Watts was asked to take a polygraph test, a lie detector test that measures physiological responses to determine if someone is being truthful. While polygraph results aren't admissible in court, they're often used by investigators as a tool to gauge the honesty of witnesses and suspects. The results of Chris's polygraph were unambiguous. He failed spectacularly. Faced with this evidence that he was being deceptive, the facade that Chris had maintained for 3 days began to crumble. But what happened next shows the calculating nature of what investigators were dealing with. Rather than confessing the full truth, Chris chose to tell a partial truth, one that made him appear sympathetic while still attempting to minimize his culpability. First, he confessed to his father, Ronnie Watts. Then, in a recorded interview with investigators, Chris made an admission that sent shockwaves through the investigation team. He confessed to killing his wife, Shanann. But his version of events was designed to paint himself as a grieving father driven to a moment of rage by an unthinkable discovery. According to Chris's initial confession, he claimed that he had discovered Shanann in the act of strangling their daughter Celeste, and that he had already found Bella's lifeless body. In his telling, he strangled Shanann in a fit of protective rage, trying to save his remaining daughter. It was a story calculated to evoke sympathy, a father who had snapped after witnessing his wife commit an unthinkable act against their children. This confession led investigators to an Anadarko oil field where Chris worked. It's important to understand the significance of this location. These oil fields are remote, industrial sites with limited access and very little foot traffic. For someone looking to dispose of bodies without detection, it would seem like an ideal location. Chris had intimate knowledge of this facility through his work, understanding the layout, the security measures, and the areas that were rarely visited. On August 16th, at 11 p.m., investigators arrived at the oil field location that Chris had marked on a photograph. What they discovered there would haunt even seasoned investigators for years to come. The bodies of 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste were found in crude oil storage tanks. To place them there, their small bodies had been pushed through hatches at the top of these tanks, hatches that were only 8 inches in diameter. The medical examiner's report would later reveal details that contradicted Chris's confession entirely. Bella had scratches on her left buttock from being forced through the narrow opening. Even more heartbreaking, a tuft of blonde hair was found on the edge of one of the hatches, suggesting the trauma these children endured even in death. These weren't the bodies of children killed by their mother, as Chris had claimed. The evidence suggested they had been alive when brought to this location. Shanann's body was found buried in a shallow grave nearby. The medical examiner determined that she had died from strangulation, consistent with Chris's confession. But the positioning and condition of all 3 bodies raised serious questions about the timeline and manner of their deaths. By the day of his arrest, the consequences of Chris's actions were already spreading beyond his family. Anadarko Petroleum terminated his employment immediately. His arrest made national news, and the company wanted no association with someone accused of such heinous crimes. The oil field where the bodies were discovered became a crime scene, affecting operations and serving as a grim reminder of what had transpired there. Chris was denied bail at his first court appearance, a decision that surprised no one given the severity of the charges and the evidence against him. But what investigators didn't yet know was that Chris's confession was only a partial truth, and that the full horror of what had happened on August 13th was even worse than they had imagined. In the months following his initial confession, the full scope of Chris Watts's crimes gradually came to light, revealing a level of premeditation and callousness. The initial story Chris had told, that he killed Shanann after discovering her harming the children, was about to be exposed as another layer of deception from a man who seemed incapable of telling the truth. The breakthrough came from surveillance footage that had been captured by a neighbor's security camera during the early morning hours of August 13th. This footage, which wasn't released to the public until November 29th, showed Chris in the hours after he had already committed these murders, methodically preparing to dispose of the evidence of his crimes. The video showed Chris loading a gas can into the bed of his pickup truck, then backing the vehicle into his garage, presumably to load his family's bodies without being observed by neighbors or other cameras. This footage proved that Shanann had never left the house alive with the children, as Chris had initially claimed to police. It also demonstrated a level of calculation that contradicted any narrative of this being a crime of passion. But perhaps the most damaging revelation came when Chris finally decided to tell investigators what had really happened. In a subsequent interview, details of which were later shared on the television program Dr. Phil, Chris's lawyer revealed the true sequence of events that night. According to this account, Chris had strangled Shanann during an argument about divorce. This wasn't a split-second decision made in the heat of discovering child abuse. This was the culmination of marital problems that had been building over time. During the murder of their mother, 4-year-old Bella had walked into the bedroom and witnessed what was happening. Imagine the terror and confusion of a young child seeing her father harming her mother. Chris told Bella that Shanann was sick, a lie that must have been devastating in its cruelty. This little girl, who should have been able to trust her father above all others, was being deceived at the most traumatic moment of her short life. What happened next reveals the true depth of Chris's depravity. He loaded Shanann's body and both girls, who were still alive at this point, into his work truck. Critically, he didn't use their car seats, suggesting that he already knew this would be their final journey. The children were placed in the back seat of the truck with their mother's lifeless body. At the remote oil field, Chris committed the final, unthinkable acts. He smothered both girls, one after the other. These weren't mercy killings or acts committed in a moment of panic. These were deliberate murders of his own children, carried out to cover up what he had done to their mother. The medical examination later confirmed that the girls had been smothered by his bare hands. The disposal of the bodies shows a continued pattern of treating his family as nothing more than evidence to be hidden. He pushed his daughter's small bodies through those narrow tank openings, then buried his wife in a shallow grave. These were people he had promised to love and protect, reduced to obstacles in his path to a new life. The investigation also revealed that Chris had been having an affair with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger. This affair appears to have been a significant motivating factor in the murders, suggesting that Chris saw his family not as beloved relatives, but as impediments to his desired future with another woman. The timing of the murders, coming shortly after Shanann's return from her business trip, suggests that Chris may have been planning these crimes for some time. Former FBI profiler Candace DeLong noted that this case was unusual in the realm of family annihilation crimes, also known as familicide. According to DeLong, most perpetrators of these crimes commit suicide after killing their families, unable to live with what they've done. Chris's attempt to continue living normally, to maintain his innocence, and to start fresh with a new relationship reveals a level of narcissism and lack of empathy that's truly chilling. The legal proceedings that followed Chris Watts's arrest moved with unusual speed, largely because of his decision to accept responsibility for his crimes, though this acceptance came only after his initial lies had been thoroughly debunked. On November 6, 2018, just under 3 months after the murders, Chris pleaded guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder. This plea deal was significant for several reasons. Most importantly, it removed the death penalty from consideration. Colorado still had capital punishment at the time of these crimes, though it would be abolished statewide in 2020. The decision not to seek the death penalty came at the request of Shanann's family, a gesture of mercy that Chris had not shown to their daughter and granddaughters. The Rozusek family's position on the death penalty speaks to their character and their understanding of what would truly serve justice. They didn't want to spend years in court proceedings, reliving their trauma through a lengthy death penalty case. They wanted closure, and they wanted assurance that Chris would never have the opportunity to harm anyone else. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole would accomplish both goals. On November 19, 2018, Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 consecutive and 2 concurrent. The consecutive sentences ensure that even if there were some unforeseen legal technicality with one conviction, the others would keep him imprisoned for the rest of his natural life. He also received an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy and 36 years for 3 charges of tampering with deceased human bodies. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for Shanann's family to address the court and to speak directly to the man who had destroyed their lives. Their victim impact statements were heartbreaking, describing not just the loss of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, but also the ripple effects of these murders on grandparents, siblings, extended family, and friends. Shanann's father, Frank Rozusek, spoke about the granddaughters he would never see grow up, never walk down the aisle, never hold grandchildren of their own. Shanann's mother, Sandra, described the daughter she had raised with such love and pride, whose life had been cut short just as she was building the family she had always dreamed of. The loss of baby Nico, who would never take his first breath, added another layer of tragedy to an already incomprehensible crime. Due to security concerns, Chris was moved out of Colorado on December 3, 2018. The nature of his crimes, combined with the intense media coverage, created legitimate fears for his safety within the Colorado prison system. On December 5th, he arrived at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security facility where he continues to serve his life sentences today. The decision to move Chris out of state was practical but also symbolic. Colorado wanted nothing more to do with him. The state had been horrified by his crimes, and there was a sense that he had forfeited any right to remain in the community where he had committed such atrocities. 7 years after the murders, Chris Watts remains in prison in Wisconsin, but his story continues to evolve in disturbing ways. Recent reports from 2024 and early 2025 reveal that Chris has been writing letters from prison, And the content of these letters shows a man who still refuses to take full responsibility for his actions. In letters obtained by various media outlets, Chris has been blaming his former mistress Nicole Kessinger, writing that she was a harlot, a Jezebel who led me astray, and claiming, "I was weak and I let her cloud my morals and my judgment." This represents a continuation of the pattern we saw during his confessions, an inability to accept responsibility without deflecting blame onto others. Perhaps most disturbing are reports that Chris now claims to have found religion in prison and believes that God has forgiven him for his crimes. He has described himself as a new man and stated that he has been forgiven for his crimes. This religious conversion, if genuine, might offer him personal peace, but it rings hollow to those who remember the calculated nature of his crimes and his repeated lies even after his arrest. The fact that Chris continues to receive mail in prison is itself noteworthy. Reports indicate he has been receiving dozens of letters, with some weeks bringing up to 60 pieces of mail, the majority from women. This phenomenon, sometimes called hybristophilia, involves attraction to individuals who have committed serious crimes. The fact that a family annihilator continues to receive romantic attention speaks to broader societal issues about how we process and respond to violent crime. Chris's current status in the Wisconsin prison system appears to be stable. There have been no reports of attacks or significant incidents, suggesting that he has found his place within the prison hierarchy. As of March 2025, there are no recent reports indicating that Chris Watts has been attacked in prison. The case continues to generate interest from true crime enthusiasts, documentary filmmakers, and those studying family violence. Netflix released a documentary about the case, and it remains a frequent topic of discussion in true crime communities. The question of what drives someone to commit such acts against their own family continues to fascinate and horrify in equal measure. The Chris Watts case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, family annihilation, and the masks that people wear in their daily lives. Here was a man who appeared to be a loving husband and father, who lived in a nice home in a safe neighborhood, who went to work every day and participated in his community. Yet beneath that facade lurked someone capable of the most heinous acts imaginable. What warning signs did people miss? Could this tragedy have been prevented? These questions haunt not just the surviving family members, but everyone who followed this case. The truth is that domestic violence often escalates in secret, and by the time it reaches the level of family annihilation, it may be too late for intervention. The case also raises questions about social media and the pressure to present perfect lives online. Shanann's enthusiastic posts about her family and her business success painted a picture of domestic bliss, but they may have masked the serious problems that were brewing in her marriage. How many other families are struggling behind carefully curated social media facades? As we reflect on this tragedy, we must remember that at its center are four innocent victims. Shanann, who was building a business and expecting her third child; Bella, who was just starting to understand the world around her; Celeste, who was still a toddler full of potential; and baby Nico, who never had the chance to take his first breath. Their lives had value far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. They were loved, they had dreams and futures stretching ahead of them, and they deserved so much better than the hand they were dealt. While Chris Watts sits in his prison cell writing letters and claiming redemption, their absence echoes through the lives of everyone who knew and loved them. The question that began this video, how well do we really know the people closest to us, remains as relevant today as it was when this case first made headlines. The Chris Watts case serves as a stark reminder that sometimes, the person we trust most in the world can also be the one who poses the greatest danger. What do you think drives someone to commit such unthinkable acts against their own family? How do we recognize the warning signs of escalating domestic violence? And you, watching this, if you spotted those early signs of strain in a friend's life, would you speak up or watch in silence until they are destroyed? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, help is available through the National Domestic Violence Hotline. The victims of this case deserve to be remembered not just for how they died, but for how they lived. May they rest in peace. Thanks for watching. If this unsettled you, hit like, subscribe, and tell me, what aspect of this story sticks with you the most? See you in the next one. Till then, stay safe, stay informed, stay vigilant.